Bob Herbert's OpEd.tv is made possible in part by the CUNY TV Foundation with the support of Ann Ulnick. Hi, I'm Bob Herbert. Welcome to OpEd.tv. One of the most disheartening aspects of the current era is the rise of anti-Semitism, including here in the United States and right here in the New York metropolitan area. There was the terrible shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, in which 11 people were killed. In Muncie, New York, a man with a machete barged into a rabbi's home and savagely attacked worshipers celebrating Hanukkah. In December, there was a murderous attack at a kosher supermarket in Jersey City, New Jersey, and there have been many other attacks and instances of vandalism and shouting of slurs. We are going to talk about the causes of this devastating surge in hatred and what we, all of us, have to do about it. My guests are Hindy Poupko, the Deputy Chief Planning Officer at UJA-Federation of New York, and Evan Bernstein, the New York, New Jersey Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League. Hey guys, welcome. Thanks for coming in. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks.
So this surge of anti-Semitism is not something that just occurred out of the blue. When did you first notice, I guess, Hindy, I'll ask you first, when did you first notice that there seemed to be an increase in these attacks and incidents around the country?
Yeah. First, thank you, Bob. Thanks for having us. Thanks for having this important conversation today. Listen, if you look at the statistics and the trends, we've seen a rise in hate crimes across the country and against the Jewish community for a number of years now, before Tree of Life. But to say that Tree of Life was not a watershed moment would be to understate what happened there. When 11 Jews were murdered in a synagogue over a year ago, it was a wake-up call to all of us that there was something profoundly wrong happening in this country, that there was new hatred against the Jewish community, not new in our long history as a people, but new in this country. It was the deadliest attack against the Jewish community in America, and it shook all of us. I will never forget what it was like to be in synagogue that Friday night after Tree of Life. I have never felt more solidarity and collective resolve than I did after the Tree of Life synagogue. And I think since then, what we've seen here in New York is a steady and persistent increase of hate crimes, particularly against the traditional Orthodox community, because they are more identifiably Jewish than many of us.
Right. Evan, when did you first notice that there was something that was changing, that there was something in the environment that was going on?
You know, I've been doing the job now at ADL for almost 7 years, and in the first few years, we would maybe have an occasional incident here or there. But really over the last 4 years, we've seen a consistent uptick in the number of assaults and the actual acts of hate, especially in K-12 schools and on college campuses. And certainly, I think the story now has been more spotlit by media because of what's happened here in the region, with what happened, as you described, in Jersey City, and the spate of attacks that we saw in Brooklyn over Hanukkah, and then bookended with what happened in Muncie. I think it's been consistently going on, and I think there's really been two different, silos of hate. We certainly see something from white supremacy, which we saw in Pittsburgh and Poway, and I think we're also now seeing a different face of anti-Semitism here in the region, which is much more around other minority groups that are attacking verbally or physically the openly Orthodox Hasidic communities here in the region. So I think it's a challenge for us as we're seeing multiple fronts of anti-Semitism and how we approach that, especially with the numbers increasing the way they are and the scale of that happening so rapidly. It's becoming difficult for organizations like ours to, I think, to be able to contend with this.
Right. So I know this requires a complex answer, but why is this happening? What are the forces that seem to have come together at this moment in our history that caused this surge in hatred? Evan, I guess I'll start with you.
So I think, again, look at both fronts. I think if you look at what's going on with white supremacy, and it really, I think, was spotlit very well in Charlottesville. I think Charlottesville showed the underbelly of the white supremacist movement and where this country really is, and people got to see it in Technicolor. what happened there, what people haven't seen in maybe 20, 30 years, when Richard Spencer and David Duke and the rise of the white supremacist movement. And I think certainly the election season saw a coming out party from that side of hate and anti-Semitism, which is steadily increased since that in the last 4.5 years. And you've certainly seen so much of it going online. It's now out of the public square. You're not going to see another Charlottesville, I think, again. I think it's really now happening online, and that's rising. I think what's happening here in the New York area is very different. I think there's gentrification issues. I think there's housing issues. I think that there's underlying anti-Semitic beliefs that have been there for a long time, that these other issues are drawing out, and people are now acting out on it. And I think so it's important to look at these different silos in different ways, but I think really over the last 4.5 years has been almost a perfect storm on both sides. And I think so that's made it more of a challenge for us, because we have to look at both.
Yeah, I would just add, Bob, I think it's important to state that there's anti-Semitism in America, period, just like there's racism in America. And for those who seek to politicize anti-Semitism and say, oh, it's their fault, or it's that party or that party, really do not understand anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory that has been around for as long as the Jewish people have been around, and it mutates like a virus over time. The Jew becomes the ultimate boogeyman. Whatever is wrong in society, whatever the ills are that people are facing, they blame the Jew. And our community is particularly identifiable, and therefore when the Jew becomes the boogeyman, and there are anti-Semitic conspiracies that are coming out from the right, from the left, and everything in between, that all contributes. And if you speak to people in law enforcement, they'll also talk about a copycat cycle that we're in now. Right, and it's not only a copycat cycle, but people who seek to do us harm might also seek to almost one-up the previous attack, and that's what's so scary about what we're seeing.
I'd like to talk about the effect of everything that's occurring on the ordinary daily lives of Jews in America, and here in that would include here in the New York metropolitan area. The incidents are obviously frightening. But how are ordinary individuals and communities reacting to it, and what are some of the specific impacts that we're seeing?
Sure. If you speak to members of the Hasidic community, in particular the Satmar community in Brooklyn, I saw one of their leaders a couple weeks ago. I said, how are you? Evan was in the room as well. And he said, quite vulnerably and passionately, I'm afraid. I'm afraid. I'm afraid to walk outside. I'm afraid to see my children and grandchildren walk outside, and that is certainly the sentiment among many family members, particularly in Brooklyn. I'll also share with you personally, our subway stop on Broadway and 103rd Street a few weeks ago had not only swastikas, but a particular anti-Semitic slur. And I'm looking at the swastika, and I'm looking at my little son, who's wearing a kippah and tzitzit, right? He is more identifiable than I am in that scenario. And I was a little afraid. Would I ever take off his kippah? Never. Am I proud to be a Jew as I ever was before, and even more proud today? Yes. But was I a little afraid? Did I hold him a little closer? Yes. And I think that's what you see parents doing today, holding their children a little closer, looking around in ways they never thought to before. When I walk into synagogue, I look for the exit sign, but I'm still walking into synagogue.
Right. Evan, what are the kinds of things you're seeing, and what are parents telling their children? You mentioned that there have been incidents in the schools, for example.
Well, I mean, I think just to piggyback on what Hindy just said, I mean, my daughter is 12, and even this past Shabbat, we walked to shul, we're modern Orthodox, and she was terrified to go to shul. She was in tears, and that was a unique experience for me to have to deal with. She knows what her dad does, and unfortunately some of that trickles into the house, and I think there's a fear there. And I think other conversations I'm having with other parents, whether they're in Muncie or in Williamsburg or in Crown Heights, there is a fear of having these conversations with their children. The children are beginning to understand what's going on. They're aware enough at age 11, 12, 13 to understand the environment's changing. They understand the fear that the parents have, and I think that there's a palpable change. You know, in the K through 12 schools, you're seeing not only Orthodox children clearly that are maybe more in yeshivas or in day schools, but there's even now more incidents towards Jews in public schools where they're not openly Orthodox. Kids are not wearing yarmulkes. Kids that maybe just have a Jewish last name are getting pennies thrown at them, are being called words like kike, or being, you know, things that maybe their parents never imagined ever happening to them, or never even happened to them in their lifetime, are now happening to their children. They only maybe heard about it from their grandparents or great-grandparents. And there's been a palpable change, I think, societally, not only with the Hasidic community, but now we're starting to see that even in the more secular Jewish community.
Right. Now, you've mentioned that there have been these incidents on campuses, and some of them have been pretty ugly. I mean, there have been real confrontations, and then, of course, there's graffiti and slurs and that sort of thing. And when I think about that, it strikes me that that you have these forces or individuals or groups on the left, folks who are consider themselves liberals, consider themselves progressive, and yet you still see these instances of anti-Semitism. As a long-time and loud liberal myself, I see it as a form of betrayal. But what are your thoughts when you see this kind of thing coming from the left?
Yeah. Thanks for your question. I'd say a number of things. First and foremost, I think we should be very clear about the following, which is the persistent vilification of the Jewish state absolutely contributes to an overall environment where the demonization of the Jew becomes normalized. So let's be clear about that. Let's also be clear that often when there is a debate about Israel's legitimacy on campus, often manifested through the BDS movement, you will see swastikas on campus. That is not a coincidence, and we need to be clear about that. And the last point I want to make is that there are many people who will say, no, I'm okay with Jews. I'm just not okay with those Jews who support Israel's right to exist. The overwhelming majority of the Jewish community supports Israel's right to exist. So to say that you're only okay with 5% of us is really not okay. Right.
Evan, thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, I agree with Hindy. I think, we see the boycott, divestment, and sanction movement, which is now, on more and more campuses around the country. The founders of that movement were anti-Semitic. And I think you're now seeing more and more of that exact example where people were saying, well, I just don't like Israel, I'm fine with the Jews. We're seeing more and more of the cresting over from that language that maybe was political discourse that turns into anti-Semitic rhetoric more and more and more. And unfortunately, you even see that sometimes within even our own Jewish population, where there's people that just are self-hating and actually are standing with other anti-Semites, and which makes things even more complicated for Jewish students on college campuses who just want to be Jewish. It's not even about being a Zionist anymore, it's just about being a Jew. And if you're a Jew, you're actually pushed out of spaces, progressive spaces that Jews were used to be welcomed into with other minority groups, to be part of that tikkun olam and building a better world for all people. They're now being exacted out of those spaces, which is really a shame.
So the essential question, should be the essential question for everyone is, what do we do about this? What are we obliged to do? So let's start with what each of your organizations are doing. How are you addressing it?
Two fronts. The first front is, of course, an effort to beef up the security of Jewish institutions. That is paramount, and UJA-Federation is investing multi-millions of dollars into securing all Jewish institutions around New York, of which there are over 2,000. So this is a very large undertaking. And alongside that, bridge building. We know that hate breeds when there's ignorance and when we don't know each other. And a huge part of our efforts right now will be going community to community, neighborhood by neighborhood, finding ways to bring communities together and to increase understanding.
Evan, ADL.
I think for us, it's really three big prongs. Number one, we are still the 911 for the Jewish community when there's an incident. We try to elevate that and put a spotlight on that, work with law enforcement to make sure people in the community understand what's going on, that law enforcement does their job. Adding to law enforcement, we're the #1 non-governmental trainer of law enforcement. So we work with law enforcement on with their Center on Extremism. We give them the information they need. We work with them to make sure that partnership, where Jews did not have partnership with law enforcement in other generations, we have a very strong relationship with law enforcement. We try our best to maintain that. And I think the other part is education. We know that hate, anti-Semitism, but all hate's a learned behavior. No one is born hating anybody. And I think the fact that we are one of the leading anti-bias training organizations in public schools around the United States, especially here in New York City, is something we take a lot of pride in, because we have to get to the next generation proactively and not just continuously be reactive to these kind of incidents, but do everything in our power proactively so the next generation does not see this as normalized.
So there was a march against hatred here in New York. Thousands turned out for a walk actually across the Brooklyn Bridge. Yeah. Did you guys participate in that, and did you think it was successful?
Yes, we ran the march along with our partners at the JCRC, ADL, AJC, and others. Yes, we felt it was incredibly successful. The initial estimates were 25,000. In my non-official estimate, I think it was closer to 50,000, knowing all the people that never even made it over the bridge. I think it achieved a number of things. One, it is critical when a community feels threatened or vulnerable that they are strengthened by coming together. And part of what last Sunday was about was demonstrating our own solidarity with one another, and particularly with the communities that have been most impacted. One. Two, we needed to send a message. And the message that we sent, I think, was quite clear. We are outraged by these persistent attacks, and until the attacks end, we're going to keep marching and we're not going to remain silent. And three, and I think this is more hopeful, we were incredibly moved by the outpouring of support from communities all around New York, all walks of life, all races, all faiths, ethnicities. They showed up for us in powerful ways, and I think it was critical to show our own community and the world that we're not alone in this fight.
Now, marches and other forms of public demonstrations obviously can be helpful, can be constructive, but what can ordinary individuals do?
On the grassroots level, I think the one thing I tell people that they can do, and unfortunately fighting anti-Semitism is not like going to Habitat for Humanity and painting a house on a Sunday and you're going to be able to make a huge impact and feel really good and then go home. It's a little bit more amorphous and not as direct as that. One of the things I like to tell people that you can do is thank law enforcement, thank your elected officials, call them on the phone. The same way we lobby on certain issues, you have to thank people when they do things. And the kind of things that law enforcement has done for us around this country, especially here, what we have elected officials standing up for us, consistently, we can't just take that for granted, and we have to be able to actually make that phone call to their office and say, whoever it is, XYZ, thank you so much for your support. Thank you for everything you've done. They need to hear that. And I think I've been trying to tell synagogues to do that. I'm telling individuals to do that. Just say thank you to those people that are standing up for us, because they just don't get enough of that, and we can't take it for granted.
Hindy, what would you like to see ordinary people start to do on their own in this fight, if they want to participate in this fight?
So one of the things we've seen are verbal assaults on the subways, right? We've all been in some uncomfortable situations just being New Yorkers, right. But in particular, identifiable Jews have been verbally assaulted on the subway stations. I think in those instances, whether you're riding a subway car or on the street, if someone's being verbally assaulted because of who they are, New Yorkers of goodwill need to stand up. They need to approach the individual, block them from what's happening. B, know your neighbor. It's very easy to be anonymous in this big city, and I think what we're seeing is hate out of ignorance and not knowing the other.
Now, we briefly mentioned the role of the internet and social media in the anti-Semitism and the surge that we're seeing. Talk a little bit about what's been going on online. Evan.
So we see online hate is really the next frontier of where it's going to go. I think if you look at hate in the 60s and the 70s, even before that, you would see hate meeting in public square, kind of like what we saw in Charlottesville. And I think that's the old model. What's going to happen now is we're getting more and more people getting activated online. And that's why we opened an office in Silicon Valley, is to work with Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and other platforms where so much hate is going on those platforms, in blogs, and I think you're seeing now, especially with Pittsburgh, Poway, and others, people are getting activated online. They're not necessarily part of any one particular group, but they're part of chat rooms where they get activated, they get affirmed for their beliefs, and then they actually act out on it. And we really believe that that is where these platforms need to be held to a higher standard. And we believe in free speech, but these are private platforms, and they need to understand their role in civil society and the responsibility that they have to play.
This may be a difficult question to answer, but it's an important issue. Why should different religions and ethnic groups and people of diverse backgrounds, why should they care about this? Why should they think of this as important, not just to the country, not just to Jews, but to themselves as well? Talk about that, why people should care.
Listen, I think we've seen from history that hate leads to more hate, and hate left unchecked against a certain minority group will just mutate and morph towards another group. And if we don't stand up against hate that is now targeted against the Jewish community, we're just going to let it grow. It's a virus in our society that has to be treated as a virus and has to be combated.
Evan, you have anything to contribute to that?
I think anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine for other forms of hate. I think when anti-Semitism is on the rise, you know that there's other forms of hate that are also there as well. And I think that we need to be very aware that this is not just a Jewish issue. When we're seeing this kind of hate towards the Jewish community, we know that racism is on the rise, xenophobia is on the rise, other forms of hate are on the rise as well. And I think that's where it's really important that the relationships that Hindy's talking about with others are so important right now, because we can't stand alone, and we need to know that other groups are going through this as well. They just maybe don't have the same reporting mechanisms. They don't necessarily have an ADL or a federation to be able to have as a spokes group for them, and we need to be able to build those relationships to also stand up for them in this moment, because in my conversations, at least with other minority leaders, I know their people are going through an incredibly difficult time as well right now.
Now, you made the point in a conversation we had before the program that we're becoming desensitized in this country to a lot of different forms of bigotry, hatred, other kinds of offensive behavior. Talk a little bit about that and explain why that kind of becoming desensitized is so dangerous.
What I've seen is the normalization, really, of hate within the Jewish community. We've seen a normalization of swastika and anti-Semitic graffiti. We've certainly seen now a normalization, I think, of assaults. And I am concerned about the normalization of murderous acts on Jews when you have 18 months Pittsburgh Poway in New Jersey City and a progressively less of a response publicly to each one of those 3 murderous acts. If that is happening within the Jewish population, you know there's normalization also going on towards immigrant populations, other minority groups of color. And if there is that kind of normalization taking place and desensitization where we're not responding the same way, it's just another mass shooting, it's just another act of hate, that normalization is going to impact our next generation. If we have 12, 13, 14-year-olds that accept mass shootings, accept these kind of acts of hate towards different minority groups as the norm, where is that going to leave our society in 15 or 20 years?
Right. We've been talking about the things that are occurring now, and in many cases, they're truly frightening. But if we take a look at the long term, what are the kinds of strategies you'd like to see us pursuing as a society to deal with anti-Semitism, other forms of bigotry and hatred?
I think education is key, and I know we say education about a lot of things. In this case, it's really true. We need to learn about each other. It starts not when you're 18 and going on the college campus. It starts when you're in kindergarten. Who are all these communities that live in New York? What do they look like? Why do they dress that way? What is a yarmulke? Right? We have to educate our young people about what the Jewish community is all about alongside other communities. We have to learn about each other. So education is key, and it's certainly the long game. Getting to know each other is a piece of it as well. And I also think a piece of the equation is the more nuanced conversation about the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's a complicated one, it's not an easy one, but I think if we avoid the conversation, we're missing a piece of what's happening.
Evan, what would you like to see as sort of almost a long-term strategy?
Well, I think it piggybacks very much on what Hindy just said. I think education is critical. I think we need to get to as many young people as possible. There needs to be more mandatory anti-bias education in schools. We need to understand that this trend is not going away. So we need to do everything in our power to get in front of it, especially in public schools. I think also, as Hindy said, so much anti-Semitism right now is around, and working with other minority groups, Israel seems to be this wedge issue, and we need to actually have those conversations, those hard conversations about that issue, and actually, maybe dispel some myths, but also try to find the commonalities between our groups instead of trying to find those things that are different. And I think once that happens, then the impact overall will be much greater, and we'll have a much stronger unified force in fighting this hate, where instead of being so fragmented.
So we've run out of time. I want to thank you both for coming in. This has been a great conversation. Hindy Poupko and Evan Bernstein, I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you.
We'll be back in a moment with a final word. As the world grows ever more complex and the challenges loom larger and larger, Donald Trump has been busy waging war against the efforts of scientists who are trying to improve American lives and government. Here's the incredible lead from a recent page-one story in the New York Times. In just 3 years, the Trump administration has diminished the role of science in federal policymaking while halting or disrupting research projects nationwide, marking a transformation of the federal government whose effects, experts say, could reverberate for years. According to the Times, political appointees have shut down government studies, reduced the influence of scientists over regulatory decisions, and in some cases pressured researchers not to speak publicly. Research efforts into climate change and public health issues have been upended. A study of the effects of chemicals on pregnant women ground to a halt when supporting funds from the federal government were suddenly cut off. Research opposed by the coal and oil industries has been hammered, and scientists by the hundreds are leaving the federal government. This dismal, destructive situation would have been even worse if not for the intervention of Congress. Trump has tried to impose massive budget cuts on such agencies as the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Energy, and the National Science Foundation. Congressional lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, have blocked those cuts. We should be clear about what Donald Trump is doing to this country. He is causing great harm. He is a master not of progress, but of regression. That is not a political statement, it is a fact, a tragic fact. And facts, as our founding father John Adams told us, are stubborn things. That's all for now. See you next time.